Welcome to another episode of Read the Room. I'm your host, Rich Patterson. About a year and a half ago, I started building buyer coding. And buyer coding for me initially was really just a framework that was going to help sales leaders, CEOs, and founders to teach something that was easily adoptable, but also in my 14 years of sales leadership experience and 20 plus years of sales, it was the one component of all the processes that I had learned that I felt could make a meaningful impact in a short amount of time. And that's the real thought process around buyer coding, right? Because all the years that I've gotten to a sales organization and came in with a go-to-market strategy, in most cases, if during the interview process they said, hey, are you going to bring in, a specific sales process? I would always say, hey, I'm going to, the first 30 days, I'm going to try to understand the landscape, and then we'll build, more of a framework around what should work. And for the most part, it was rooted in sales psychology because I felt like most sales reps struggled with understanding how to take control, with how to, really dig into pain, not just ask surface level questions. And for me, those were the things that really moved the conversion lever. Those are the things that moved the time to revenue and shrunk sales cycles. So it was impactful, but there wasn't something that was real, I would say, process related. It was a lot of gut feel. It was a lot of me using my experience. And then the question was always, well, what happens when Rich isn't here anymore? Are they going to follow kind of these, I would say principles? So we built buyer coding. One of the root things that buyer coding solves is you don't necessarily need more leads. You need to be able to convert on the leads you have. And that's the goal of buyer coding. How we do that is it's very counter everything that we were taught before. When I say everything, I mean specifically around personas. So if you grew up in sales in the past 15 years, you were taught CFOs cared about money. You were taught, CEOs cared about specifically just big picture and closing. And, for the most part, everything was really based on titles. And after enough research and seeing these type of patterns and commonalities show up on calls, one of the things that I learned pretty quickly was that your persona has really nothing to do with the way that you prefer to make larger buying decisions. So what that means is every single individual, no matter what company they work for, if they are a decision maker, there are ways that they go about making decisions. And this could be whenever they go buy a flat screen TV. This could be whenever they purchase a car. This could be even sometimes smaller decisions where they're choosing a fine dining restaurant or, things that I guess ultimately require some type of thought process, not just impulsive decisions, right? And your point of contacts at the companies that you're selling to, they're individuals just like you and me. They are responsible for making decisions. Sometimes there's buying committees, right? But the one thing that was always taught was depending on their title, that's going to determine what's important to them. And after researching this and watching this show up enough, one of the things that I learned was this is not only is it not true, right? It's broad brush painting something that ultimately comes from different places. And so what's the origin of whether someone and how someone makes buying decisions? There's a few of them. One is going to be, could this be something that they learned in their past, right? So if, let's say an example, you had a close relationship with your dad and your dad used to show you how to pull out a Google sheet or write notes, weigh out pros and cons, and analyze every aspect of a decision, then most likely there's a big part of you that's going to be an analyzer, right? And you're going to really look into fine print. Data really matters on the decisions that you make, right? I'll give you another example. This could be a piece and an origin story of how you make a decision. If you are, let's say, a younger founder and you grew up in these tech founding communities, and every single time you're in one of these Slack channels or WhatsApp channels or community meetings, they talk about speed to decision, right? They talk about the importance of being on the front end and first to market, right? If you were building out an AI company over the past 5 years, it was important that you got ahead of the game because AI was moving so quickly. Well, that type of influence would create someone who wants to move quickly, that wants to make decisions pretty quickly, that thinks that weighs out risk, and a lot of times will be willing to take that risk. And so in buyer coding, we would call that a closer. So I gave you an example of an analyzer. I gave you an example of a closer, but there's obviously, we've broken it down to 5, and those 5 are analyzer, closer, defender, validator, and visionary. And, once you start to have these conversations with your prospects and you're asking the right thought-provoking questions, what happens is they give you the tells. So think poker. When someone makes a specific face, you have an idea on whether they're bluffing or not, right? Well, when we're having these conversations and we're doing true discovery and we're doing true needs analysis and we're applying buyer coding, what happens is you can have these conversations and ask these thought-provoking questions, and you'll be able to determine what type of buyer they are. What is the reason that they buy that way, and what is their preference in terms of making decisions, right? So that's how we get to buyer coding. Now, the type of questions that you're going to ask are not normally the normal discovery questions that you've learned in the past. So I'm going to ask some real thought-provoking questions. One of my favorite is, let me ask you, when you've bought a product like this or you bought a service like this, I looked at your LinkedIn. It's obvious you have experience. You've done this before. And I'm sure you don't take this decision lightly. When you do make a decision like this, what would you say is the hardest part about it? Like, what is the most challenging part about making a decision like this? And by asking a question like that, they ultimately are giving you their tell, right? So they might say something like, honestly, it's, we've been burned in the past. So we picked a service, this is what happened, and they tell you a story about being burned. Well, heartburn, right? That type of experience, if you're someone that has had that before, and it really trumps the way that you make decisions moving forward because it was that bad of a heartburn, guess what? You're most likely going to be a defender. But I wouldn't know that if I didn't ask a thought-provoking question like, what's the hardest part about making a decision like this? So now we've mapped the buyer, right? The second part of truly, right, understanding the buyer is asking what we would call decision risk questions. So now that you've identified what type of buyer they are, right, the real question is, what could prevent this deal from moving forward? So in this scenario, they've got heartburn, they're a defender. I might ask them some more thought-provoking questions like, so when you're choosing a new partner, understanding the experience you've had before, what are the key elements to making your decision this time? What exactly are you trying to prevent? And how does that show up in a future partnership? Is this mostly stuff related to the agreement or the contract? Or is this going to be related to the smoothness of an onboarding process? Is this going to be access to customer service? Like, what are the things that you're trying to prevent from happening again, right? And again, what you're bubbling up is decision risk. And I do this early on, or we teach and coach and train to do this early on, as early as the discovery and needs analysis, because you want to get these questions, you want to get these issues uncovered now, way before the demo, way before the let's say the one-on-one meeting or the tour, or if you're going to bring in cross-functionally more people. Because guess what? These challenges or these ways that customers think about buying and the decisions and the risks that are involved, they're only going to bubble up more throughout the process, right? And what the biggest mistake is, most reps will skip past it. They don't want to bring up head trash. They're worried about it. And so they might skip past a lot of these things. They come up later, or they come up later in the contract, and then you never preempt to strike them. You never discuss them. And all of a sudden they disappear because there's something in there that's very scary. Right? So we're going through these decision risk review. Now, once we've identified the type of buyer they are, what they need for decision risk, the next real agenda for you is to really gain decision confidence. And what does decision confidence truly mean? Well, they, as buyers today, and this is something I haven't spent a lot of time on, but I'll tell you, buyers today are showing up very different. Oddly enough, sellers are still showing up very, close to the same. The last sales process created was about 10 years ago. There's frameworks everywhere out there, but I would say most are not speaking to modern buyers. So the modern buyer shows up, they're extremely educated, they've done their AI research, they understand your product, they've looked at reviews, they've looked at Reddit, they've looked at you name it, right? They've back channeled your active customers. They are really trying to get as much information as possible before they even waste their time showing up to a meeting. So at this point, most likely that buyer has done a lot of research about you, right? And so now you're having a real conversation. You're bubbling up decision risk. You're asking thought-provoking questions. You've identified their preference in terms of the way that they like to buy. And now you're moving on to how do I develop some type of decision confidence, right? And this decision confidence is going to come from you customizing and curating and tailoring your presentation to what exactly that customer has told you, right? So when I create a deck or we're demoing the product, everything is going to be based on the type of buyer they are, right? So think about their buyer code, what they need, and what they're concerned about in terms of the risk, right? And it could be one or the other. If they're a closer, they might want to move very quickly. So the risk that you have as a seller is not moving quick enough and maybe sometimes providing way too much information, right? Whereas if they're a validator, at any point in time, if you haven't offered a reference or you haven't offered a case study or you haven't offered some testimonials, there's a good chance they're not going to move through because you haven't validated the information. Or if there's concerns about your product and you're demoing the product and you haven't specifically hit on those concerns, then guess what? You're going to miss on a validator, right? So once we've gotten to that point and we truly have curated this real custom proposal, right? And we've understood everything around like what's going to make them feel confident in their decision, then that's when it's time to start looking at potentially agreements and contracts. So until I've done all of that, right, then I haven't done enough to earn their business. And so when you find that buyers start to ghost you or they stay with the incumbent, they stay with their current provider, they don't make the decision, or they choose someone else, 9 times out of 10, you have not identified what type of buyer they are. You have not bubbled up any type of decision risk and addressed it. And when I say bubble it up and address it, I mean, have you validated that it's real decision risk? Did it come from their mouth? Is it an assumption, right? We want to determine whether it's validated. And then what have we done to minimize it? What have we done to make it no longer a risk, right? And I want to make sure that that's actually a conversation that I'm having where I might say to that prospect, I might say, I remember on our first call, you said you were really concerned about A, B, and C. One of the things that we've learned with talking to our customers is they feel like A, B, and C, right, was addressed and they were able to do whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. Do you feel like we've presented it in a way where that's a green flag versus a red flag, right? Clearly ask the question. Let's determine it, because if you're taking a concern and you're valid and you haven't validated it, but more importantly, you haven't removed the risk, well, the chances of them moving forward, the chances of them having decision confidence are slim to none because you haven't addressed some of the main issues, right? I would say this, that when you really look at the landscape today, there's many sales processes that are out there. The question really has become, have sales changed or have buyers changed? And the truth is, sales hasn't changed very much. There's tools that are out there. There's AI components that you can use to really identify when is a good time to reach out to a buyer. There's obviously all the Claude and ChatGPT that you can use to make sure that you're showing up clearly prepared. But in most cases, the buyers are now shifting the leverage. And so as a current seller today, if you are not clearly identifying what type of buyer you're talking to, and again, not persona based, truly, how do they make decisions? If you haven't bubbled up any type of decision risk over the course of those conversations before you throw a contract out there, and your buyer doesn't have clear decision confidence, and remember, this is decision confidence, this is trust. Not only trust in you, not only trust in your company and your product, it's trust in themselves. So they've got to have the trust in themselves. But if they don't have that decision confidence, and you haven't removed risk, and you haven't clearly identified and tailored your solution towards them, you are missing the boat today with modern buyers. So that's buyer coding. I'm Rich Patterson. Thanks for listening to this episode. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching today's episode. And if you found value in it, do me a favor, like, follow, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. If you want to learn about buyer coding, head on over to my website, www.buyercoding.com. And then if you're ready to introduce decision-centric selling to your organization, our sales methodology built around understanding how your customers make decisions, removing decision risk, and building decision confidence, please send me a DM if you're interested in booking the decision-centric selling workshop. And then ultimately, if you want to become a sponsor of the show, please reach out to me at rich@buyercoding.com. Until next time, don't just read your prospect. Remember to read the room. Thanks again, guys.